Hi there. This is reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 14, Part 2. So it was very difficult extracting excerpts from this second half because the thought process he's going through pretty much has to be read through. It has to be followed from start to finish to understand how he arrives at his propositions. And in this case, the inadequacy of old ways of thinking to deal with new problems or to see problems afresh is the theme of this chapter. So this chapter introduces the concept of peace of mind. It critiques reason. It's an ongoing thing that you see emerging. It observes how topsy-turvy our world has become, and it gets to the root of the matter, or at least it starts to. And it all begins with Deweese trying to figure out how to assemble an outdoor grill with these supposedly perplexing instructions. At least that's how Deweese sees it. And as Pirsig does all throughout this book, he uses everyday situations to illustrate the deep and lofty ideas he's trying to convey. I say deep and lofty on purpose. That is also a theme. It's at the bottom and it's at the top. So Deweese can't understand the instructions, and he asks the narrator to check and see if the instructions make sense. Because remember that Pirsig, once he got out of the psych unit of the hospital, he didn't go back to his old job. He didn't become a professor again. He became a technical writer. And in fact, when he was writing the book, he was a technical writer. He had a 9-to-5. And I might have mentioned this, but I think I'll mention it again because it's interesting. He wrote this book, for the most part, from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning, every day before work. He looks at the instructions and he can't actually find anything wrong with them. So he gloms onto this one fact, to try to make Deweese feel better, I guess, that you can't see the diagrams when you're looking at the instructions. The diagrams are somehow inaccessible. This isn't why Deweese found them so hard to understand. It's just the lack of smoothness and continuity which threw him off. He's unable to comprehend things when they appear in the ugly, chopped-up, grotesque sentence style common to engineering and technical writing. Science works with chunks and bits and pieces of things, with the continuity presumed, and Deweese works only with the continuities of things, with the chunks and bits and pieces presumed. What he really wants me to damn is the lack of artistic continuity, something an engineer couldn't care less about. It hangs up, really, on the classic romantic split, like everything else about technology. So a good example of the split here is based on the artist's inability to grasp the engineer's worldview. Like I said, it's using an ordinary situation to illustrate extraordinary concepts. Now, I like this next part. But Chris, meanwhile, takes the instructions and folds them around in a way I hadn't thought of, so that the illustration sits there right next to the text. I double take this, then triple take it, and feel like a movie cartoon character who's just walked beyond the edge of a cliff but hasn't fallen yet because he hasn't realized his predicament. And now the narrator introduces another concept that will figure prominently into this burgeoning theory, and that is peace of mind. What I wanted to say, I finally get in, is that I've a set of instructions at home which open up great realms for the improvement of technical writing. They begin. Assembly of Japanese bicycle require great peace of mind. Peace of mind isn't at all superficial, really, I expound. It's the whole thing. That which produces it is good maintenance. That which disturbs it is poor maintenance. What we call workability of the machine is just an objectification of this peace of mind. The ultimate test is always your own serenity. If you don't have this when you start and maintain it while you're working, you're likely to build your personal problems right into the machine itself. It's a hard concept to grasp, and the Deweeses don't know what he means. What he means is the machine isn't right because the thing itself isn't right or wrong. It's just a thing. It's an object. The only test is the value it has for you. If you're disturbed by it, it's you, not the machine. even if it's not working. Do you kind of see that? The working machine kind of pairs up with your expectations of it. So what your expectations are is going to be what the machine is. The test of the machine is always your own mind. There isn't any other test. Deweese asks, what if the machine is wrong and I feel peaceful about it? Laughter. Everyone laughs. I reply, that's self-contradictory. If you don't care, you aren't going to know it's wrong. The thought will never occur to you. The act of pronouncing it wrong is a form of caring. Peace of mind from not caring is not peace of mind. It's just avoiding the whole thing. This is the basis, actually, of many psychological ills. It's a faux peace of mind. You just avoid it so it's not bugging you, really. Yeah. But that faux peace of mind is just not caring. It's an escape, but it's a shallow one. If you care, you're in the state of mind that can make things better. If you are not caring, if you're, let's just say, nihilistic, good luck to you. Your worry about the rotisserie is the same thing. You haven't completed the ultimate requirement of achieving peace of mind because you feel these instructions were too complicated and you may not have understood them correctly. So this would be another situation where you'd give up, say, because it's too hard. Both of these are hang-ups, the not caring, avoiding it, or just giving up. And you have two choices. You can do these kind of tactics that either infuriate you or just isolate you, alienate you from the whole thing. Or you can do the lateral drift, and we talked about that. Only one of these states of mind will put you in touch with the solution. And we talked about the lateral drift in chapter 11. There's sort of these aimless segues until something emerges that you care about enough to pursue it. And we'll talk about that in a second. In a lateral drift, you can't allow avoidance or nihilism to kick in. You just have to be with it. The lateral drift is about accepting that you have a hang-up, that you're stuckness, and just kind of going with what happens until there's something that really emerges that you care about. And by pursuing that thing you care about, you start to arrive at a solution. What's really angering about these instructions is that they imply that there's only one way to put this rotisserie together, their way, and that presumption wipes out all the creativity. Actually, there are hundreds of ways to put the rotisserie together, and when they make you follow just one way without showing you the overall problem, the instructions become hard to follow in such a way as to not make mistakes. You lose the feeling for the work, and not only that, it's very unlikely that they've told you the best way. So we assume that the official way is the right way. The instructions that come with the grill have to be right? Not so fast, says the narrator. He's a technical writer, so he knows how these instructions get written. So typically, he says, they get the biggest goof off on the assembly line to describe how it's put together, and they write down what the guy says, and voila, the instructions. So this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the point is that there is a format deeply embedded in technology, that there's only one right way to do things. At least that's our understanding. But if you look at this humorous situation and you see how the right way is derived, maybe what he's saying makes a little more sense. And Deweese figures that was the case all along. So technology presumes there's only one right way to do things, and there never is. There's a selection from many choices. The art of the work is just as dependent upon your own mind and spirit as it is upon the material of the machine. That's why you need peace of mind. So then he evokes the craftsperson, and which he often does in various forms in this novel, the person who cares about his work, the motorcycle mechanic who cares versus the sloppy one who listens to the music and has their tools everywhere. Think of, if you've read C.S. Lewis, the Screw Tape Letters, You have the person, you have two kinds of Christians, the one who's in it to look good, to look virtuous, to see if the neighbors are watching, and the one who is truly inspired by wanting to live in Christ. And we'll see this in a few chapters coming up about the mountain pilgrimage he takes in India. Sometime look at a novice workman or bad workman and compare his expression with that of a craftsman whose work you know is excellent, and you'll see the difference. The craftsman isn't ever following a single line of instructions. His motions in the machine are in a kind of harmony. When mind and the nature of the material, when mind, I guess you could say mind and matter, are in harmony, the creation takes a back and forth nature, perhaps what Jonathan Vervaeke would call the flow state. And this goes on until the cycle is over, until the craftsman's mind is finally at peace. So it's not when the item looks like it does in the brochure, or when it achieves an acceptability, let's just say, or good enough. It's when the craftsperson feels serenity. And when that happens, the craftsperson's mind is at peace and he can let his work go. So this kind of craftsmanship, even with technology, even with motorcycle maintenance, is of course the same as art. And the narrator states, this divorce of art from technology is completely unnatural. It's just that it's gone on so long, you have to be an archaeologist to find out where the two separated. Rotisserie assembly is actually a long-lost branch of sculpture, so divorced from its roots by centuries of intellectual wrong turns that just to associate the two sounds ludicrous. So you see, again, I'm going to point out that what's emerging is the necessity to go back to the beginning. If there's a problem, if there's a serious metaphysical problem, you need to go back to the beginning, to where it started. And going all the way back is getting to the root cause. These revelations are both intriguing and disconcerting to people. You've got a bunch of people around listening to them, and they're somewhat perplexed. I mean, think about it right now. Instructions are only one way to do things, but not the only way. That's his proposition. So what kind of implications are contained in that notion for the whole structure of a system that's based on there being one rational right way, one rational truth? When you've got a Chautauqua in your head, it's extremely hard not to inflict it on innocent people. So the Deweeses, being a nice counter to the narrator, the narrators, you can say he's big yang with a little bit of yin. They are big yin with a little bit of yang. And so they kind of get it. And they're interested in what he has to say. And they remark on his ideas and wonder how long these things have been milling around in his head. And he says, 20 years. And then he makes another statement, which reminds me of the synchronicity as described by Jonathan Pageau. You can explore this for yourself in a video below. It's called, I think it's called Literal and Symbolic Meaning in the Bible, something like that. But I'll put a link below. So patterns emerge from your experience, from the flow of your experience, and these patterns are meaningful to you, and they create meaning. They circle around. You have something that's meaningful for you. The patterns emerge from your past experience, and you put it all together, and that creates meaning. I add almost to myself, you look at where you're going. Okay, so listen to what I just said, and this is related to Pageau's video. I ask almost to myself, you look at where you're going and where you are, and it never makes sense. But you look back at where you've been, and a pattern seems to emerge. And if you project forward from that pattern, then sometimes you can come up with something, meaning. The pattern that's emerging for the narrator is a transcendence of a sort. not just transcending the artificial separation of art and technology, but that between reason and feeling. They just don't connect in our modern Western worldview. People haven't paid much attention to this before because the big concern has been with food, clothing, and shelter for everyone, and technology has provided these. But now, where these are assured, the ugliness is being noticed, the ugliness of technology, more and more. And people are asking if we must always suffer spiritually and aesthetically in order to satisfy material needs. Lately, it's become almost a national crisis. Anti-pollution drives, anti-technological communes, and styles of life and all that. Meaning crisis. Look at Vervaeke. What's emerging from the pattern of my own life is the belief that the crisis is being caused by the inadequacy of existing forms of thought to cope with the situation. It can't be solved by rational means because the rationality itself is the source of the problem. But again, you can't run away from technology and only pay attention to romantic quality or your feelings. That's just a pendulum swing. It's an artificial, equally artificial form of compensation. So it's something like perhaps what the 19th century romantics were attempting. They're giving you all romance and no structure, and you need both. So what's the solution? The solution to the problem isn't that you abandon rationality, but that you expand the nature of rationality so it's capable of coming up with a solution. So the rationality we use now, and I think this is another thing Vervaeke said, is not the rationality of the ancient Greeks. It's based on the rationality of Newton, who used as a basis for his rationality the assumption of instantaneous change. Now, I got this out of the book, so I don't fully understand this, but I'm just going to convey it anyway. Mathematically, you couldn't assume a zero rate of change, so something had to factor that in. You know, this had to, in order to, for Newton to restructure rationality for the scientific the worldview, he had to somehow program in instantaneous change. And that something that he developed was calculus, which is still used today. So what the narrator is saying is we're still in the Newtonian rationality. We still use Newtonian rationality as a framework. And remember back in chapter 3, Newton, law of gravity. So Newton is a big, big ghost in our, let's just say, a big ghost directing our understanding of reality. But the point is, rationality is not as fixed as we think it is because it's already transformed. And it's also, at this point, not as useful as we think it is. Newton invented a new form of reason. He expanded reason to handle infinitesimal changes, and I think what is needed now is a similar expansion of reason to handle technological ugliness. The trouble is that the expansion has to be made at the roots. Now he makes another observation, which I'm going to relate back to our times, and which is an extension of this meaning crisis that we're suffering now, the meaning crisis of the 20th and 21st century, where it's especially becoming pronounced. We are living in topsy-turvy times, and I think that's what causes the topsy-turvy feeling is inadequacy of old forms of thought to deal with new experiences. I've heard it said that the only real learning results from hang-ups, where instead of expanding the branches of what you already know, you have to stop and drift laterally for a while until you come across something that allows you to expand the roots of what you already know. Topsy-turvy times such as those he was beginning to see are, like I said, full-blown now. Again, look at Pageau's work for a good description of the end of the cycle where things become chaotic, where we live in an upside-down world, where things that were valuable are debased and where things that were base are now valuable. When things are this chaotic, they're going to have to regroup. But how? What do we do to facilitate that regrouping? And so what Pirsig recommends is the lateral drift, one where you don't force, You wait until something of quality emerges that helps you with this problem, that helps you reorient, reorganize. During periods of root expansion, things have always looked as confused and topsy-turvy and purposeless as they do now. So, not the first time. The whole Renaissance is supposed to have resulted from the topsy-turvy feeling caused by Columbus's discovery of the New World. If you really try to hold back your present knowledge about the consequences of his trip and project yourself into his situation, then sometimes you can begin to see that our present moon exploration, remember this is 1968, our present moon exploration must be like a tea party compared to what he went through. Moon exploration doesn't involve real root expansions of thought. We've no reason to doubt that existing forms of thought are adequate to handle it. It's really just a branch extension of what Columbus did, a really new exploration, one that would look to us today the way the world looked to Columbus, would have to be an entirely new direction. Okay, so a lot of the technological advances we see, and this very much includes the internet, we think they're so new and so powerful, and they are. But we are approaching the internet and the information we get from the internet, and you can see this in the news, with the old rationality, and that doesn't allow us to comprehend it in a way that's useful to us. That's why, for example, and I've mentioned this before, you can take facts and formulate different narratives based on the same facts, the same actually happened, and you interpret how those things happened and you formulate them into a narrative, and those narratives can be equally plausible. That's because they're all rational. But this rationality is not giving us something we can really use anymore. It's not helping us discern which way to go politically. If you can just formulate, an absolutely plausible narrative with rationality, because there's so much to choose from in order to do that. At least this is how I see it. I mean, I think maybe you might have a different idea, but this is kind of what I'm understanding. Like what? Like into realms beyond reason. I think present-day reason is an analog of the flat earth of the medieval period. We fear giving up our old ways of seeing things because we may fall off the edge of the earth. That's how it's going to feel. But we know something's missing. And as the old flat earth of conventional reason becomes less adequate to deal with the topsy-turvy world, we're getting more and more people in irrational areas of thought. Occultism, mysticism, drug changes, and the like, because they feel the inadequacy of classical reason to handle what they know are real experiences. I'm going to evoke Pageau and Vervaeke again on this one because they both have pointed this out. This chapter really parallels a lot with what both of them are saying. And so, fortunately for us, he's going to give us a definition of classical reason, one we can work with. Classical reason, analytical reason, dialectical reason. Reason at the university is sometimes considered to be the whole of understanding. During this time, the narrator is also trying to piece together what he knows and thinks and how it relates to Phaedrus. So he's Phaedrus is emerging. He's not fighting it anymore. He's seeing the utility of Phaedrus. He's seeing that this is going to help him. Phaedrus, old Pirsig and new Pirsig, are trying to come together to do something of real significance. There's still a lot of resistance on the part of new Pirsig. So he asks the Deweeses, who must know about this memory loss because they know about his breakdown and the hospitalization, if he ever mentioned Phaedrus, which leads to a discussion about the sophists. And the sophists were rhetoricians. The rhetoricians of ancient Greece, because the Phaedrus dialogue by Plato is why it goes in this direction. The rhetoricians of ancient Greece were the first teachers in the history of the Western world. Plato vilified them in all his works to grind in acts of his own, and since what we know about them is almost entirely from Plato, they're unique in that they've stood condemned throughout history without ever having their side of the story told. The Church of Reason that I talked about was founded on their graves. It's supported today by their graves, and when you dig deep in its foundation, you come across ghosts. This is true today because when you go online and look up philosophy, if you're trying to learn Plato, if you're trying to learn the ancient Greeks, there's always this kind of most people go along with Plato and they say, well, the sophists kind of sucked because they would they were persuaders, and there's a smarminess associated with that because they valued persuasion and not the truth. So, what is the truth again? Good question. I look at my watch. It's after 2. It's a long story, I say. You should write this all down, Jenny says. I nod in agreement. I've been thinking about a series of lecture essays, a sort of chautauqua. I've been trying to work them out in my mind as we rode out here, which is probably why I sound so primed on all this stuff. It's all so huge and difficult, like trying to travel through these mountains on foot. But he expresses some problems he's having writing them out. He's worried he won't be able to convey properly through the essay, chautauqua format at least. And Jenny DeWeese has, the DeWeeses have always supported him, and Jenny DeWeese is being a good muse when she says, you should do it anyway, Jenny says, without trying to get it perfect. That might be tough for a classical thinker. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.